Hello everyone and welcome back. Forget what you think you know about fairy tales. Forget the story of the lost princess found. The real story begins not in a palace, but in a mental asylum in Berlin, February 1920. A young woman is pulled from the icy waters of the Landwehr Canal. She carries no identification. She speaks in frightened whispers, her body a roadmap of scars. For months, she is just another nameless casualty of the Great War, another broken soul locked away in the Doldorf asylum. But then she begins to talk, and the story she tells isn't just a story. It's a claim that will light a fire across Europe, a fire that will burn for nearly a century. She claims she is a ghost, the ghost of a girl murdered 2 years earlier, half a continent away. She claims her name is Anastasia Romanov, Grand Duchess of Russia. And with that single claim, one of the greatest mysteries of the 20th century is born. Was she the real thing, an impossible survivor of a massacre, or was she the most convincing impostor the world had ever seen? To understand the madness that followed, you have to understand the world that was lost. Before the blood, before the cellar, there was the Alexander Palace. It wasn't just a home, it was a fortress of opulence, a golden cage. Here lived Tsar Nicholas II, emperor and autocrat of all the Russias. A man who was, by all accounts, a devoted husband and father, but a disastrously incompetent ruler. He believed God had personally chosen him to rule, a divine right that made him blind to the world crumbling outside his palace gates. His wife, the Tsarina Alexandra, was even more removed from reality. A German princess, deeply mystical and unpopular, she was fiercely protective of her family, especially her only son, the Tiesevich Alexei. Alexei was the heirlessty. He was also a boy living under a death sentence. He had hemophilia, the royal disease, a genetic curse passed down through Queen Victoria's bloodline. A simple fall, a minor cut, could trigger uncontrollable bleeding and excruciating pain. This secret sickness shaped everything. It drove Alexandra into the arms of mystics and charlatans, chief among them to the Russian people. Rasputin was a debauched peasant, a devil in monk's robes who held a hypnotic power over the imperial family. To Alexandra, he was a holy man, the only one who could stop her son's bleeding. His presence in the palace became a symbol of the rot at the heart of the monarchy. And in this gilded, suffocating world, there were the 4 Grand Duchesses. Olga, the thoughtful one; Tatiana, the elegant leader; Maria, the gentle beauty. And then there was Anastasia, the youngest. The family called her Shibzik, the imp. She was a force of nature, a whirlwind of mischief. She climbed trees, played pranks on tutors, and mimicked guests with ruthless accuracy. She was the spark of life in a family that was becoming increasingly isolated, a symbol of an innocence that was about to be brutally extinguished. They lived a life of unimaginable privilege, yet they were prisoners of their own status. They couldn't walk the streets or meet ordinary people. Their world was a carefully curated bubble of tutors, servants, and state functions. It was a life disconnected from the 100 million peasants starving in the fields, from the soldiers dying in the trenches of World War I, a war Russia was catastrophically losing. The people's patience had run out. The Tsar, at the front lines playing at being a general, had become a distant, hated figure. The Tsarina, a German, was accused of being a spy. Rasputin's scandalous reputation tainted them all. The pressure built and built until, in February 1917, the dam broke. The revolution wasn't a single event. It was a tidal wave. Bread riots in Petrograd escalated into a full-blown insurrection. The army, the Tsar's last line of defense, mutinied. One by one, his generals and ministers advised him to step down. In a quiet, almost pathetic ceremony aboard his royal train, Nicholas Arthur abdicated the throne, ending 300 years of Romanov rule. He seemed more relieved than devastated. He thought he could retire, become a simple country squire in England. The family was placed under house arrest in the Alexander Palace. Their golden cage had finally become a real prison. At first, life wasn't so different. They still had servants, still followed their daily routines. But outside, the world was changing fast. The provisional government that replaced the Tsar was weak. Power was shifting to the more radical Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin. To Lenin, the former Tsar wasn't just a retired monarch. He was a living symbol of the old regime, a potential rallying point for counter-revolution. He was a threat that needed to be managed and ultimately eliminated. In August 1917, the family was moved. They were woken in the middle of the night, told to pack and put on a train heading east into the vastness of Siberia. Their destination was Tobolsk, a remote town far from the political chaos of the capital. Here they were housed in the former governor's mansion. Their guards were still respectful, their confinement still relatively comfortable. They chopped wood for exercise, put on plays for entertainment, and clung to a desperate hope that they would be rescued. Anastasia celebrated her 7th birthday there, but hope was a dwindling commodity. In October, the Bolsheviks seized power in a coup. The civil war began, pitting Lenin's Red Army against the anti-Bolshevik White Army. Suddenly the Romanovs weren't just political prisoners, they were pawns in a brutal war. Their value as hostages was immense. As the White Army advanced across Siberia, Lenin grew paranoid. What if the Whites rescued the Tsar? He could be used to rally foreign support, to turn the tide of the war. The decision was made to move the family again to a more secure location, deep in Bolshevik held territory, the industrial city of Ekaterinburg. In the Ural Mountains, Ekaterinburg was the end of the line. The family was imprisoned in a large house commandeered from a local merchant named Nikolai Ipatiev. The Bolsheviks called it the House of Special Purpose. It was a grim, menacing place. The windows were painted over. A high wooden stockade was built around it, blocking out the sky. The guards were no longer respectful old soldiers. They were hard-faced Bolsheviks, factory workers and former prisoners, filled with ideological hatred for their captives. They scrawled obscene graffiti on the walls, stole the family's possessions, and subjected them to constant psychological torment. The family doctor, Eugene Botkin, a loyal retainer named Alexei Trupp, a maid, Anna Demidova, and a cook, Ivan Karitonov, had chosen to stay with them, a decision that would seal their fates. Life became a monotonous nightmare of confinement and fear. They had no news of the outside world. All they knew was that the White Army was getting closer. The sound of artillery, to the Romanovs, it was the sound of hope. To their captors, it was a ticking clock. The man in charge of the House of Special Purpose was Yakov Yurovsky. He was a new kind of Russian, a cold, meticulous functionary, a true believer in the revolution. He saw the Romanovs not as people, but as a problem to be solved. He tightened security, catalogued the family's remaining possessions, especially their jewels, and waited for orders from Moscow. The order came in mid-July 1918, a coded telegram. The advance of the White forces made further delay impossible. The sentence had to be carried out. There would be no trial, no public announcement. Just an execution, a liquidation. Yurovsky began his preparations with chilling efficiency. He selected the executioners. He chose the location, a basement room at the back of the house. It was small, barely 25 feet by 20 feet, with a single barred window, perfect for the task. To prevent anyone from hearing the gunshots, he ordered a truck to be started in the courtyard, its engine running loudly. On the night of the 16th of July, the family went to bed as usual. Just after midnight, Yurovsky woke them. He told them there was unrest in the town, that they needed to be moved to the basement for their own safety. The family, accustomed to being moved and always fearing separation, complied without argument. They were tired, confused, but not yet terrified. Nicholas carried his. The Tsarina and her daughters followed, carrying pillows and their small dogs. The servants came last. They were led down the stairs and into the empty cellar room. The air was damp and smelled of earth. Chairs were brought for the Tsarina and Alexei. The others stood, lining up against the back wall as if posing for a family photograph. They waited. Anastasia stood with her sisters, her little dog Jemmy at her feet. Minutes ticked by, stretching into an eternity. The family grew uneasy. They started asking questions. Yurovsky stalled, saying he was waiting for the truck. Then he entered the room with his hand-picked squad of killers. He stepped forward, pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, and read a prepared statement. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. In view of the fact that your relatives are continuing their attack on Soviet Russia, the Ural Executive Committee has decided to execute you." Nicholas turned to his family, then back to Yurovsky, stunned. What? What? He stammered. He didn't even have time to process the words. Yurovsky raised his pistol. That was the signal. Chaos erupted. The small room exploded in a deafening barrage of gunfire and smoke. Each executioner had been assigned a target. Yurovsky shot Nicholas' point. Blank. The Tsar crumpled to the floor, dead instantly. Then the Tsarina killed by a bullet to the head. The room filled with acrid smoke, plaster dust, and the screams of the dying. The plan had been for a quick, efficient execution. It was anything but. When the smoke began to clear, the Bolsheviks saw something horrific. Several of the daughters were still alive. They were writhing on the floor, wounded but protected. The bullets were ricocheting off their bodies as if they were wearing armor. For a moment, the killers were stunned, superstitious. Was it divine intervention? The truth was far more practical and far more tragic. For months, the Tsarina and her daughters had been sewing their fortune into their underclothes. Diamonds, pearls, and precious gems stitched into the linings of their corsets. They hoped to use them to fund an escape. Instead, their hidden wealth had become a makeshift and horrifyingly ineffective bulletproof vest. It didn't save them, it only prolonged their agony. The killers, their discipline broken, fell upon the survivors with a savage frenzy. Those who were still moving were bayoneted and shot in the head. The room became a slaughterhouse. It was brutal, personal, and bloody. Anastasia was one of the last to die, clubbed and stabbed in the chaotic darkness. In less than 20 minutes, it was over. 11 bodies lay in pools of blood on the cellar floor. The Romanov dynasty was history, or so it seemed. The disposal of the bodies was as chaotic and panicked as the execution itself. Yurovsky's plan was to take them to a deep, abandoned mineshaft called Ganina Yama. Miles outside the city, they loaded the bodies onto the truck and drove into the pre-dawn darkness. But the truck got stuck in the mud. The mine shaft wasn't as deep or as remote as they had hoped. As the sun rose, Yurovsky realized he was running out of time. The White Army was closing in. He made a new plan. 2 of the bodies, those of the youngest, Alexei, and one of his sisters, were to be taken away and burned separately. He hoped this would confuse anyone who might find the grave. The remaining 9 bodies were stripped, doused in sulfuric acid to disfigure them, and dumped into a shallow pit, which was then covered with railway ties and earth. It was a shallow, pathetic grave for the last rulers of an empire. Yurovsky wrote a detailed, secret report of the entire operation, a report that would one day become a crucial roadmap for investigators. But for now, silence. The Bolsheviks announced that the Tsar had been executed, but claimed the family was safe. It was a lie designed to placate the world and confuse their enemies. And in that lie, in the confusion of the 2 separate graves, a legend found room to grow. Now, let's go back to Berlin, to the Doldorf asylum, 2 years after the massacre. The nameless woman from the canal, known only as Fräulein Unbekannt, the unknown woman, is beginning to cause a stir. A fellow patient, a woman named Clara Puthert, notices the strange, aristocratic way she carries herself. She becomes convinced the woman is a Romanov. She starts telling people, the story gets out. Russian Satmagrots, the shattered remnants of the old aristocracy living in exile in Berlin, begin to visit the asylum, hoping to find a lost Grand Duchess. A living miracle. One of the first was Baroness Sophie Buxhoeveden, a former lady in waiting to the Tsarina. She looked at the woman in the hospital bed and saw no resemblance. She declared her a fraud. But others weren't so sure. Captain Nicholas von Schwabe, a former personal guard of the Dowager Empress, saw her and was deeply shaken. He noted her eyes, her mannerisms. He began to believe. The turning point came with the arrival of Gleb Botkin. He was the son of Dr. Eugene Botkin, the family physician who had been murdered alongside them in the cellar. Gleb had played with the imperial children as a boy. He was consumed by grief and a desperate hope. He saw the woman, and in her he saw his childhood playmate Anastasia. He became her fiercest, most loyal champion, her knight in shining armor. He would dedicate his life to proving her identity. With Botkin's help, the woman left the asylum. She took the name Anna Anderson, a name she would carry for the rest of her life. She began to live with a series of Russian tante-migrante patrons who funded her life in exchange for proximity to what they believed was royalty. The story she told was fragmented, filled with the gaps and terrors of trauma. She claimed that she had survived the shooting, protected by the jewels sewn into her clothes. She said she was bayoneted, but only pretended to be dead. In the chaos of moving the bodies, a sympathetic soldier, a man named Alexander Tchaikovsky, had discovered she was alive and rescued her. He and his family had smuggled her out of Russia, across Romania, to Berlin, where he was tragically killed in a street fight, leaving her alone and destitute, leading to her suicide attempt. It was a dramatic, romantic story, and for many it was utterly believable. Anna seemed to know things only Anastasia could know. Intimate details about the inside of the palace, family nicknames, private jokes, long-forgotten secrets of the court. She spoke of a specific porcelain animal on a mantelpiece, of a hidden pin that the Tsar used to scratch the inside of his boot. How could a stranger, a peasant, know such things? Her body also seemed to tell a story. She had scars that corresponded to the wounds Anastasia would have suffered from a bayonet. She had a deformed foot, a hallux valgus deformity. Just like the Grand Duchess. When she smiled, there was a distinctive gap in her teeth, identical to Anastasia's in photographs. The evidence was compelling. The Romanov family, what was left of them scattered across Europe, was thrown into turmoil. Some were desperate to believe. Others were horrified. The Tsar's sister, Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna, traveled to Berlin to meet Anna. Their meeting was a disaster. Anna was hostile and paranoid, and Olga left convinced she was a cruel impostor playing on their family's grief. But the most significant meeting was with Princess Irene of Prussia. Irene was Alexandra's sister, Anastasia's aunt. She visited Anna, but the meeting was tense. Later, however, Irene was reported to have said, "I see in her the niece I have lost." The family was divided. The supporters, led by Gleb Botkin, saw a traumatized survivor, her mind and memory shattered by her ordeal. Her inability to speak Russian a symptom of psychological trauma. The detractors saw a cunning actress with an uncanny resemblance, coached by her supporters to learn the secrets of the court. Then came the counter-narrative. A private investigator hired by the Tsarina's brother, Ernest Louis, Grand Duke of Hesse, launched an investigation. He claimed to have found Anna's true identity. He alleged she was a Polish, German factory worker named Franziska Schanzkaus. Franziska had a history of mental illness. She had been severely injured in a factory explosion, which could account for her scars. She had disappeared from her family home in Berlin shortly before Anna Anderson was pulled from the canal. The Schanzkow family was brought in to identify her. Her brother, Felix, looked at Anna and declared, "That is not my sister." But the story stuck. It provided a neat, simple explanation. For the rest of her life, Anna Anderson would be haunted by the ghost of Franziska Schanzkaus. The battle lines were drawn. Was she Anastasia Romanov, the miraculous survivor, or was she Franziska Schanzkow, the traumatized factory worker? The fight moved to the courts. In 1938, Anna's supporters filed a lawsuit in Germany to have her legally declared as Anastasia. They wanted to unlock the considerable fortune that the Tsar had allegedly deposited in foreign banks before the revolution. This lawsuit would become one of the longest and most complex legal cases in German history, spanning nearly 4 decades. The court heard testimony from hundreds of witnesses, friends, servants, relatives, handwriting experts, forensic anthropologists. Every memory, every scar, every turn of phrase was scrutinized. The evidence piled up on both sides. One former tutor swore it was her. A former chambermaid swore it was not. Handwriting analysis was inconclusive. A comparison of their ear structures, considered as unique as a fingerprint, showed a startling similarity, but another anatomical comparison showed discrepancy. It was a dizzying, contradictory mess. The court case dragged on through World War II and into the Cold War. Anna herself was a difficult protagonist. She was often erratic, hostile, and paranoid, alienating many potential supporters. She moved to the United States in the 1920s, causing a media sensation. She lived a reclusive, eccentric life, eventually marrying a wealthy history professor, Jack Manahan, and settling in Charlottesville, Virginia. She became a bizarre local figure, living in squalor with dozens of cats, still insisting to anyone who would listen that she was the last daughter of the last Tsar. Finally, in 1970, the West German court delivered its final verdict. After 32 years, the judges concluded that Anna Anderson had failed to provide sufficient proof that she was Anastasia Romanov. But, crucially, they also stated that her opponents had failed to prove she was not. It was a legal stalemate. The court could not say who she was. The mystery was left unresolved, deeper and more frustrating than ever, to her followers. This was a victory. The court hadn't called her a fraud. To her detractors, it was a clear loss. She had failed to prove her case. Anna Anderson died in 1984, still legally unrecognized, taking her secrets, whatever they were, to the grave. For many, that was the end of the story, a fascinating, unsolved historical puzzle. But another story had been unfolding in the background, a secret story. While Anna Anderson was fighting in the German courts, the truth lay frozen in the Siberian earth. For 70 years, the Soviet Union had suppressed any real investigation into the Romanovs' fate. The Ipatiev House was unceremoniously demolished in 1977 by Boris Yeltsin, then a local party boss, on orders from Moscow, who feared it was becoming a site of monarchist pilgrimage. The location of the grave was a state secret. But secrets have a way of getting out. The key was Yakov Yurovsky's secret report. Copies had circulated among high-level Bolsheviks. In the 1970s, a Russian geologist and amateur detective named Alexander Avdonin got his hands on a copy. He, along with a filmmaker friend, Jelly Ryabov, began a secret, dangerous quest. Using Yurovsky's detailed descriptions of the location, a place he called Pig's Meadow, marked by a specific configuration of birch trees, and a bridge of railway ties. They began to search the woods outside the city. It was a painstaking clandestine operation. They knew that if the KGB found them, they would be imprisoned or worse. In 1979, after years of searching, they found it. Probing the ground, they hit the railway ties Yurovsky had described. They dug carefully at night and uncovered a mass of bones. They found skulls, some with clear bullet holes. They knew they had found the Romanovs. Terrified of the consequences of their discovery, they reburied the remains, swore an oath of secrecy, and waited. They waited for over a decade for the world to change, and change it did. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Boris Yeltsin was now the president of a new democratic Russia. Avdonin and Ryabov came forward with their story. In a moment of incredible historical whiplash, Yeltsin, the man who had demolished the Ipatiev House, now ordered an official excavation of the grave they had found. The world watched, breathless. A team of Russian forensic scientists began the grim task of exhuming the bodies from the shallow pit on Koptyaki Road. What they found was a tangled mess of 9 skeletons, damaged by acid and the passage of time. The process of identification was slow and meticulous. They pieced together the skeletons, noting ages, heights, and old injuries. They found the remains of 4 servants, Dr. Botkin, and the imperial couple, Nicholas and Alexandra. They confirmed Nicholas's identity through skeletal analysis, matching his skull to pre-existing photographs. But then came the puzzle. They found the skeletons of 3 of the daughters, but not 4, and there was no sign of the young Tsarevich, Alexei, 9 bodies. Not 11, 2 were missing. Exactly as Yurovsky's report had described. The 2 youngest, Alexei and one of his sisters, had been taken elsewhere. But which sister? The Russian scientists, based on their initial analysis, concluded that the missing daughter was Maria. But some American experts who were brought in to consult disagreed. They argued, based on dental records and bone development, that the missing girl was Anastasia. The old mystery suddenly roared back to life. If Anastasia's body wasn't in the grave, could Anna Anderson have been telling the truth all along? For a tantalizing moment, it seemed possible. Her story, her scars, her strange knowledge. It all seemed to click into place. The scientific evidence had just... The supporters of Anna Anderson felt vindicated. This was the proof they had been waiting for. But a new kind of science was about to enter the story, a science that would be more definitive than any eyewitness testimony or anatomical comparison. The science of DNA, forensic genetics, was still a relatively new field, but it held the key. The plan was simple, but brilliant. To prove the skeletons belonged to the Romanovs, scientists needed a DNA sample from a known relative. Luckily, the royal families of Europe are all famously interrelated. The Tsarina Alexandra was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria of Great Britain. This meant she shared a direct maternal line of descent, and therefore the same mitochondrial DNA with Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, the husband of Queen Elizabeth II. Prince Philip agreed to provide a blood sample. A British forensic scientist, Dr. Peter Gill, led the team. They extracted mitochondrial DNA from the bones of the Tsarina and her 3 daughters found in the grave and compared it to the DNA from Prince Philip's blood. The result was a perfect match. There was no doubt. These were the Romanov women. To identify the Tsar, they used DNA from 2 other living relatives. And again, a perfect match. The science was irrefutable. The family, or most of them, who was the missing daughter? And more importantly, what about Anna Anderson? The first question was still a matter of debate between forensic anthropologists, but the science had a definitive answer for the second. The ghost of Anna Anderson and her alter, Ego Franziska Schanskau, had one last appearance to make. As it turned out, a small tissue sample from Anna Anderson had been preserved in a Virginia hospital where she had undergone an operation years before her death. Dr. Peter Gill and his team obtained a piece of this sample. Their lab was about to become the final courtroom in the longest identity case in history. They performed 2 tests. First, they compared Anna Anderson's DNA to the Romanov DNA extracted from the bones and from Prince Philip. If she were Anastasia, her mitochondrial DNA would be a perfect match for her mother and sisters. The results came back. There was no match. Not even close. Anna Anderson was not a Romanov. After 70 years of speculation, of hope and belief, the story she had told, the final nail in the coffin was the second test. The scientists tracked down a living maternal relative of the long-dead Polish factory worker Franziska Schanskau, a man named Karl Morcher, her great-nephew. They took a sample of his DNA and compared it to the DNA from the Anna Anderson tissue sample. It was a perfect match. The woman who claimed to be Anastasia Romanov, who had convinced so many and fought for so long, was in the end exactly who her detractors had always said she was. Franziska Schanskau, a troubled woman from a tragic background, whose own trauma had somehow fused with the epic tragedy of the Romanovs, creating a fantasy she may have come to believe herself. The mystery was solved. And yet, one final piece of the puzzle remained missing. The 2 children. Alexei, the heir, and the last daughter. Where were they? Their absence continued to fuel conspiracy theories and doubts. The Russian Orthodox Church, deeply skeptical of the investigation, refused to formally recognize the bones without the complete family. The search continued. For years, local enthusiasts and archaeologists combed the woods around the first grave site. They followed the clues in Yurovsky's report, looking for the site of a second, smaller burial. They found nothing. Then, in the summer of 2007, a group of amateur searchers, using metal detectors and steel rods to probe the ground, finally got a hit just 70 meters from the main grave. They found a small, burnt depression in the earth. They began to dig. What they found were 44 small, charred bone fragments and teeth. The bones had been smashed with shovels burned in a bonfire and doused with acid, exactly as Yurovsky had described in his report. It was the second grave. Genetic testing was immediately undertaken by multiple international laboratories to ensure there could be no doubt. The DNA from the bone fragments was compared with the DNA from the first grave. The results were conclusive. The fragments belonged to 2 individuals, a boy aged between 12 and 15 and a young woman aged between 17 and 20. A final sophisticated round of DNA testing confirmed their identities beyond any shadow of a doubt. They were Tiasevich, Alexei, and one of his sisters. Most scientists, reconciling the genetic evidence with the skeletal remains, now believe the daughter found in the second grave was Maria, meaning the body initially thought missing was Anastasia's after all, and she had been in the main grave all along. With that final discovery, the family was complete. The entire Romanov family, Nicholas, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, died together in that cellar in Ekaterinburg. There were no survivors. There was no escape. The fairy tale was a lie. So why did the world want to believe in Anna Anderson so badly? Why did this myth have such incredible power for so long? Perhaps it's because the truth is too brutal. The murder of the Romanovs wasn't just a political act. It was the murder of a family, the slaughter of children. It was a story of such senseless cruelty that people needed a glimmer of hope, a different ending. They needed a survivor. Anastasia, the rebellious, spirited imp, was the perfect candidate for that survival story. Anna Anderson, whether a conscious fraud or a delusional woman, stepped into a role the world was waiting to fill. She gave people a fairy tale, a story of impossible escape and a lost princess. It was a story that was more compelling, more romantic, and more hopeful than the ugly reality of a bloody cellar and a shallow, muddy grave. Science gave us the truth, hard, definitive facts. It closed the book on the Romanovs and on the woman who claimed to be one of them. The truth is often less romantic than the legend, but it is in the end all we have. The ghosts of the Ipatiev House can finally rest. The last secret of the Romanovs has been told. That is all for today. If you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, be sure to like and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.